The last stage of Gerald's crusade began not with noise but with a strange stillness. For days after the explosive HOA meeting, after the neighbors rallied and the police circled closer, I noticed something unsettling in the feeds from my hidden cameras. Gerald's house, normally buzzing with visitors, phone calls, late-night arguments with his wife on the porch, went dark. Curtains stayed closed. His car remained in the driveway unmoved. No board members came and went. The trench around my home lay abandoned, weeds beginning to sprout at the edges, the mounds of dirt hardening in the sun. It looked like a project dropped mid-sentence. That was how I knew something was wrong. Men like Gerald don't vanish quietly. When their power erodes, they don't retreat into silence. They prepare for the last swing. I checked the cameras obsessively, every feed, every angle. The nightbirds rustled, headlights from cars flickered past on the street, but Gerald did not appear. Not until the fifth night. At exactly 2:33 a.m., motion alerts jolted me awake. The feed from the backyard lit up first. Gerald alone was climbing down into the trench with something strapped across his shoulder. At first I thought it was a weapon. My heart jumped, but as he turned, the lens caught the shape. It wasn't a gun. It was a bag, heavy, stuffed to bursting. He crouched in the trench, unzipping it, and one by one began pulling out papers, folders, ledgers, contracts. I recognized the HOA letterhead, even in the grainy night vision. He wasn't there to attack me. He was there to bury something. I zoomed in, hands trembling on the controls. He dug frantically with a spade, sweat soaking his shirt, his movements jerky like a man possessed. Then he dropped the bag into the hole, covered it with dirt, tamped it down, and climbed back out. Glancing around as though shadows themselves could betray him, he didn't know, of course, that I had already caught every detail. The next morning, I was out there with gloves and a shovel before the sun cleared the trees. The bag wasn't buried deep. Didn't need to be. Not when Gerald was sure nobody was watching. I hauled it up, heart racing, as I unzipped the canvas. Inside were financial documents. Dozens of them. Misappropriated funds, false invoices, contracts with shell companies, even receipts tied directly to Gerald's personal accounts. He hadn't just been abusing his power. He had been stealing from the community for years. The trench wasn't just meant to trap me. It was a hiding place for his crimes. By noon, I had scanned every page, saved digital copies, and sent them to my lawyer, the local police, and to news reporters who had been hounding me for updates. By evening, the neighborhood was swarming with cameras again. Microphones shoved over fences, neighbors gathering in clumps to whisper. Gerald's house was lit up like a stage, and when the police finally pulled into his driveway, the crowd surged. They let him out in handcuffs, red-faced and snarling, spitting accusations at everyone, me, the cops, the neighbors, the reporters. You'll regret this. All of you. You think this is justice? This is a setup. But his words were drowned out by the flash of cameras, the murmur of the crowd, the weight of the evidence. Watching from my porch, I should have felt relief, maybe even triumph. But instead, what I felt was something colder, heavier, because in his eyes, I saw no hint of regret, no recognition of guilt, only hatred. Hatred that burned hotter than ever, directed at me with a precision that made the hairs rise on my arms. That night, after the sirens faded and the neighborhood settled into uneasy quiet, I sat by the monitors, replaying the footage of him burying the bag. My home was scarred yard torn apart, fences destroyed, neighbors shaken, but I was still standing. The cameras had saved me, every hidden eye-bearing witness when no one else would have believed. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that Gerald's trench had been more than just intimidation, more than just a hiding place. It was a symbol, a boundary he wanted etched into the earth itself. Because even as the HOA dissolved, even as petitions flew, even as lawyers circled and neighbors rebuilt their trust, that trench remained. A circle carved around my home, a reminder that at any moment, someone who hates you enough can try to dig you in, wall you out, or bury you alive. I didn't fill it in, not yet. Some neighbors asked why, And I just shook my head. Because the truth is, I wanted it there. I wanted everyone who walked by to see what had been done, to see how far a man obsessed with power and control had gone. And I wanted a reminder for myself that vigilance is not paranoia when people really are out to get you. In the weeks that followed, Gerald's arrest snowballed into something bigger. State investigators uncovered ties to other HOAs, other fraudulent contracts, other hidden trenches in metaphor, if not in earth. My footage became part of a broader case, one that stretched beyond my quiet street. Neighbors who had once cowered under his rules now stood taller, prouder, freed from the shadow of his authority. They thanked me, though I always told them the same thing. I didn't beat him. The cameras did. The truth did. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not just about standing up to bullies, not just about exposing corruption, but about the power of watching when they expect blindness. People like Gerald thrive in shadows. They count on silence, intimidation, and fear. But the moment someone shines a light, whether it's a camera lens, a microphone, or a single voice refusing to be quiet, that power crumbles. As I sit here now writing this, the trench still rings my home, half overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. It looks almost like a moat, though no drawbridge crosses it, no castle walls rise behind it. Just an ordinary house, lived in by an ordinary man who refused to be broken. And though Gerald is gone, his trial looming, his empire shattered, I can't shake the sense that he's still out there somewhere, watching, waiting, replaying his loss over and over. If you're reading this, if you've ever faced people who tried to wall you off, scare you, Barry, you remember this? Don't back down. Don't surrender to silence. Document everything. Guard yourself with truth, and never underestimate the power of proof. Because sometimes the deepest trench your enemy digs becomes the grave for their own lies. And sometimes the cameras you hide are the only reason you survive to tell the story. So stay vigilant. Stay recording. And never let them believe for even a second that you aren't watching. The sixth part of this battle unfolded with a strange quiet. After the news crews left, after neighbors retreated to their homes, the trench sat like an open wound around my property. The barbed wire coils remained piled at the edge, untouched, as if the HOA was deciding whether to follow through or retreat. But Gerald was not the kind of man who retreated. For a few days, nothing happened. The trucks stayed away, the workers vanished, and the silence itself became suspicious. I checked my cameras more obsessively than ever, combing through each recording, each shadow, car passing slowly down the street. Gerald didn't show his face. It was as though he had slunk into his lair to plot. That stillness was worse than the chaos. Because silence is never just silence, it's the inhaled breath before the strike. During this lull, something unexpected happened. Neighbors began visiting me. First Mrs. Callahan again, then a young couple who had only recently moved in. They were tentative, nervous, but each said a version of the same thing. We saw the footage. We had no idea it was this bad. They brought small offerings, coffee, groceries, even just conversation. For the first time, the isolation Gerald had tried to manufacture began to crumble. The neighborhood was waking up. People whispered about petitions to remove the HOA board, about calling for an emergency vote. Gerald's grip was loosening. But when cornered animals feel that grip slip, they lash out. I knew the retaliation would come. I just didn't know how. On the fourth night of quiet, it finally happened. At 2 a.m, my cameras picked up motion at the far end of the trench. Not the usual contractors, but a group of masked men in dark clothing. They weren't carrying tools, they were carrying gas cans. My blood ran cold. I zoomed in on the feed, heart pounding so hard it drowned out every other sound. They doused sections of the fence, splashing liquid across the wood like it was nothing more than kindling. My hand hovered over my phone, ready to dial 911, but I forced myself to wait just long enough. My cameras recorded every drop, every face partially revealed when a mask slipped, every whispered instruction. And then I called. The operator's calm voice was a lifeline. Within minutes, sirens cut through the night. The men scattered, abandoning their cans, diving into a black SUV that screeched away down the street. But it was too late. The police had already seen the smoke rising, the evidence left behind. They questioned me, examined the footage, bagged the gas cans as evidence. And Gerald? He appeared on his porch, robe tied loosely, feigning shock. What on earth is happening? He called out to the officers, pretending to be just another concerned resident. But my cameras had captured what his face betrayed when he first stepped out. He wasn't shocked. He was furious. Furious his plan had failed. Furious that fire hadn't consumed me in the night. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. The news vans returned. Arson attempt at homeowners' property, the headline blared. Neighbors who had once avoided me now lingered by my fence, whispering about Gerald. Even those who had defended him were shaken. Fire was too much, too blatant. But Gerald didn't fold. He doubled down. At the next HOA meeting, which I attended with several neighbors in tow, Gerald stood at the head of the table, red-faced, veins bulging. This man is destroying our community. He thundered, pointing at me. He's manipulating the media, fabricating stories, turning you against your own board. I didn't flinch. I simply reached into my bag, pulled out a USB drive, slid it across the table to the police officer who had been invited after the arson attempt. Everything you need, I said calmly. The officer plugged it into his laptop. The screen behind the board flickered to life, showing the footage I had compiled, the masked men with gas cans, the SUV's license plate, Gerald pacing in the shadows nearby, his phone glowing in his hand as he whispered into it. The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, shouts. Gerald lunged forward, sputtering. That's out of context. That proves nothing. But it was too late. The officer froze the frame on his face, illuminated just enough to be undeniable. Neighbors rose to their feet, some pointing, some shouting. You tried to burn him out. This is criminal. You're done, Gerald. The officer didn't arrest him then, but the look in his eyes said everything. Gerald was no longer just a neighborhood tyrant. He was a suspect. In the days that followed, Gerald's empire crumbled. Contractors refused to return. The trench remained unfinished, the barbed wire abandoned. Neighbors drafted an emergency petition to dissolve the current HOA board. The news coverage exploded, drawing county inspectors, lawyers, even state officials curious about the madness in our little neighborhood. But victory wasn't clean. Gerald still had his claws. He filed countersuits, claiming harassment, defamation, emotional distress. He barked at cameras about being a victim of digital manipulation and conspiracy. And at night, though his public mask was cracking, I knew he was still out there watching me, hating me. One night, I caught him on my cameras again. Alone, pacing the edge of the trench, muttering to himself, fists clenching. He looked less like a leader and more like a man unraveling, consumed by the very war he had started. I realized then that Gerald wasn't just trying to trap me. He was trapped himself in his obsession, his need for control, his refusal to admit defeat. And that made him more dangerous than ever. The neighborhood was shifting, yes. The law was circling, yes. But Gerald wasn't finished. The man who had dug a trench to imprison me, who had tried to set fire to my home, who had turned a community into a battlefield, he wasn't capable of surrender. And if he had one last move, I knew it would be the most desperate, the most reckless of all. The siege wasn't over. The final confrontation was still coming. The 5th chapter of this siege began like an ordinary morning. Sunlight streamed through my blinds, casting long bars of light across the floor. But the sound outside was different, busier, louder, like a swarm gathering. When I peered through the window, my suspicion was confirmed. Gerald had doubled his forces. More contractors, more trucks, more materials. The trench now had wooden frameworks all along its edge, and piles of fencing leaned against my mailbox like soldiers waiting to be deployed. They were no longer hiding their intentions. They were accelerating. It wasn't intimidation anymore. It was an all-out assault on my life. My driveway was partially blocked by equipment. My trash collection had been accidentally missed 3 times in a row. Letters with fines for known compliance appeared in my mailbox daily. The HOA was tightening the screws. I could almost admire the efficiency of their cruelty almost. But the anger inside me burned hotter than ever. I didn't just sit at my desk anymore. I became a ghost in my own neighborhood. At night, while they slept, I walked the perimeter of my property, inspecting every bolt, every post, every inch of fencing they'd erected. My cameras were no longer my only defense. They were my weapons. I now had terabytes of footage. Gerald giving illegal orders. Contractors questioning the legality, neighbors voicing their doubts. I even captured one of the board members muttering, "This is going too far," as he walked past the trench. But I was careful. Gerald was paranoid now, and paranoia makes people sloppy but also dangerous. I noticed him scanning my windows sometimes, his eyes narrowing. Once, I caught him craning his neck toward my backyard, as if trying to spot my hidden cameras. He knew he was being watched, but he didn't know how thoroughly. Meanwhile, the internet clip I'd posted had gone viral. Local news outlets had picked it up, running headlines like HOA harassment. Homeowner claims neighborhood board dug trench around his property. Reporters began emailing me asking for interviews. I ignored them at first, but the pressure on Gerald was mounting. Neighbors whispered louder now, some even filming the trench themselves. The HOA's narrative was cracking. One evening, just before sunset, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Mrs. Callahan stood there, her dog at her side, eyes darting nervously. "I shouldn't be here," she said in a low voice. "But you're right. This isn't normal. Gerald's been telling everyone you're dangerous, that you're some kind of criminal. But I've lived here 20 years. I know crazy when I see it, and this," she gestured toward the trench. "This is crazy." I stepped aside to let her in. She hesitated, then crossed the threshold. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I think he's planning something worse," she whispered. "I overheard him on the phone yesterday. He said something about a final step. I don't know what that means, but..." She trailed off, glancing at the cameras on my monitors. I leaned forward, my voice steady. "You did the right thing coming here. And you're safe. Everything Gerald has done is on record." Her eyes widened slightly. "You're recording all of it?" "Every second," I said. "And when the time comes, everyone will see it." Mrs. Callahan nodded slowly, her shoulders relaxing. "Good, because people are scared. They think if they speak up, they'll be next." After she left, I sat in the dim glow of my monitors, thinking about her words. A final step. What could that be? More fencing? A legal eviction attempt? Something worse? Gerald was obsessed, and obsessed men don't stop. They escalate. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window with the lights off, headphones on, listening to the audio recorder pick up the night's whispers. Around 2 in the morning, the contractors arrived again. They were quieter this time, moving like thieves. I zoomed in on one of my camera feeds and saw something chilling. Rolls of barbed wire. They were unloading barbed wire. My pulse spiked. This wasn't just a fence anymore. This was a prison. They were going to top the structure with barbed wire, turning my home into something out of a dystopian nightmare. No HOA could justify that as property enhancement. It was pure aggression, a final insult meant to break me. But instead of breaking, something inside me hardened. They had just handed me the nail in their coffin. Barbed wire was the visual that would end them. No city inspector, no court, no neighbor could look at barbed wire around a private home and call it safety. I stayed perfectly still, watching them unroll the wire and set it aside. Gerald stood off to the side, his arms crossed, a self-satisfied smile plastered on his face. My cameras caught it all. High definition, multiple angles. The next morning, I sent the footage anonymously to the local news. Within hours, a news van rolled up outside my house. Reporters stepped out, cameras pointed at the trench, at the fence, at the barbed wire waiting to be installed. Neighbors gathered, murmuring, some even shouting questions at Gerald when he emerged from his house. "This is harassment," one woman yelled. "You can't do this." Another man barked. Gerald tried to wave them off, tried to smile for the cameras, but the cracks were showing. His face flushed red. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "This is all within HOA guidelines," he shouted. "We're protecting the neighborhood." The reporters weren't buying it. Their lenses zoomed in on the barbed wire, on the trench, on the ridiculousness of it all. and for the first time, Gerald looked small. Inside, I sat at my desk, my heart hammering as I watched the live news feed on my screen. This was it. The tide was turning, but I couldn't relax yet. Gerald still had his final step, whatever it was. And desperate men are dangerous men. That night, as darkness fell, I reinforced my home. Not with weapons, but with vigilance. I double-checked my cameras, my backups, my locks. If Gerald was planning something, I wanted to see it coming. And I wanted to be ready. Because the war wasn't over. But for the first time since it began, I wasn't just defending myself anymore. The world was watching. The neighborhood was doubting. The fortress Gerald had tried to build around me was becoming his cage instead. And if you've ever stood up to someone who thinks their power makes them invincible, you know the feeling, the slow, steady shift when you realize the tide is finally, inevitably turning. The fourth segment of this nightmare began with silence that felt unnatural, like the neighborhood was holding its breath. After the contractors had set the cement and frames in place, there was a lull. Days passed where nothing happened, no trucks, no digging, no Gerald parading his smugness across my lawn. But the absence of activity was worse than the noise had been, because silence meant planning. Silence meant the next move was already unfolding behind closed doors, and I wasn't about to let them blindside me again. I doubled my vigilance. Every night I checked the feeds for my hidden cameras, watching the shadows, logging timestamps, cataloging even the smallest movements. Every day I walked the perimeter, documenting the trench, the stakes, the hardened cement rods that now jutted out of the ground like the bones of some buried creature. Neighbors avoided my gaze, but I could feel their unease. The anonymous letters I had dropped into their mailboxes had planted doubt, but Gerald's flyers had painted me as a paranoid recluse. The balance could tip either way, and I needed to make sure the truth won. One afternoon, while I was outside photographing the cement posts, Gerald himself strode over, his chest puffed out like he was marching into battle. "Enjoying the improvements?" he sneered. I kept my camera steady, refusing to look at him. "I'm documenting vandalism," I said flatly. "Vandalism?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "This is progress. You'll thank us when your property looks respectable." I finally turned to him, my eyes locking on his. "You're burying yourself, Gerald. Every word you say, every step you take, it's all being recorded." For a split second, his smug mask cracked. His eyes narrowed, lips twitching before he forced the smile back into place. "Record all you want," he said. "Without context, it's nothing. You think the city will side with you? You're one man. We're the board. We make the rules." Then he walked off, but his words lingered in the air like smoke, and as much as I wanted to dismiss them, I knew there was truth in them. The HOA thrived on bureaucracy, on layers of rules designed to choke anyone who resisted. They had power in numbers, connections with city inspectors, even influence over the police. My evidence was strong, but if I played it wrong, they could twist it until I was the villain again. That night, I reviewed not just the footage, but the patterns. Gerald was arrogant, but he wasn't reckless. His moves followed rhythms work done at night. Flyers distributed during the day, contractors arriving every 3 or 4 evenings. They weren't improvising. They had a plan. I needed to anticipate it. So I began mapping everything out, drawing diagrams of the trench, noting dates and times, overlaying my footage with his appearances. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. This wasn't just intimidation. This was a campaign. On the 5th night of the lull, I caught them again. The contractors arrived just after midnight, their truck lights dimmed, moving like thieves in the dark. This time they brought tall wooden planks and rolls of chain-link fencing. My cameras captured the entire process post set into the cement rods. Planks hammered into place, wires stretched tight across the gaps. The sound of metal clanging echoed in my headphones as I watched in real time. They weren't hiding anymore. They were building a cage. My blood ran cold as I realized what it would mean. A fence, even under 4 feet, would box me in completely. No easy exit, no driveway access without their permission. They were turning my home into a fortress of their design, not mine. And once it was complete, they'd justify it with paperwork and bylaws until no one questioned it. But what Gerald hadn't accounted for was how blatant this was becoming. As dawn broke, neighbors emerged to see the partial fence. Whispers rose louder than ever. I watched from my window as Mrs. Callahan shook her head, her lips moving rapidly as she spoke to another neighbor. Two kids rode their bikes up to the trench and just stared, their mouths open. Gerald walked by later that morning, chin high, pretending it was all perfectly normal. But normal was exactly what this wasn't. I knew I had to push harder. The anonymous letters had shaken the narrative, but now it was time to escalate. That evening, I uploaded a carefully edited clip of the footage online. Untraceable, back to me. The video showed the contractors digging, Gerald giving orders, and the trench in its grotesque entirety. I titled it simply, HOA, Gone Too Far. Within hours it spread. Comments poured in, outrage spilling from strangers who couldn't believe what they were seeing. This looks like harassment. Is this even legal? That's insane. Why hasn't the homeowner called the cops? The clip was shared, re-uploaded, dissected. And though Gerald had control over the neighborhood, he didn't have control over the internet. For the first time, the board's power was being challenged from outside. The next morning, Gerald pounded on my door, his face red with fury. I opened it just enough to see the veins bulging in his neck. "You think you're clever?" he hissed. "Posting lies online?" "Lies?" I asked calmly. "It's your face on that video, Gerald. Your voice. Your trench." His hands curled into fists, but he didn't strike. He couldn't. He knew if he crossed that line, he'd lose everything instantly. Instead, he spat on my porch and stormed away. That day, I noticed a shift. Some neighbors who had once avoided me now looked at me differently. Not friendly, not yet, but less hostile. Suspicion of Gerald had finally taken root. Mrs. Callahan even offered a small nod as she walked by with her dog, as if to say, "I believe you." But the war wasn't over. The contractors kept coming, the fence grew taller, and Gerald doubled his efforts to paint me as unstable. Flyers accusing me of spreading misinformation appeared in mailboxes. Anonymous complaints were filed against me for noise violations and unsightly property. I knew these weren't random, they were his counterattacks, ways to bury me in paperwork and distraction. Still, every move he made, I caught. Every false complaint, every contractor visit, every whispered meeting outside his home, I had it all. And slowly, piece by piece, I was building something bigger than just a defense. I was building a trap. Because Gerald believed his power came from control, but he had forgotten something crucial. Power only lasts as long as people believe in it. And once the cracks show, once doubt spreads, even the strongest walls crumble. Standing by the trench that night, staring at the half-built cage around my home, I whispered to myself, "You're digging your own grave, Gerald," and I meant it. Because the cameras were still rolling, the files were still growing, and the world was beginning to watch. The third week brought with it a strange calm, the kind that feels like the eye of a storm. The trench sat there like a wound in the ground, raw and ugly, but the digging slowed. For a few nights in a row, I saw nothing but empty streets and quiet shadows. I wanted to believe they'd given up, that Gerald and his minions had realized the insanity of their plan and decided to retreat. But I knew better. Bullies don't stop. They regroup, plot, and wait for the perfect moment to push harder. In the daylight, I could feel the weight of the neighborhood watching me. People walked past my house faster than before, their eyes darting toward the trench, but never at me. A few of them whispered to each other, shaking their heads, some even snapping photos when they thought I wasn't looking. I knew what they were doing. They were building their own narratives. Feeding Gerald with scraps of gossip, he could twist into ammunition. Yet beneath the fear in their eyes, I saw something else. Doubt. The kind of doubt that spreads when the story being told doesn't quite add up. I spent those quiet nights reviewing footage. Every second of it burned into my mind. The outsiders with the clipboard haunted me. Contractors meant permanence. If they went ahead with construction, the trench wouldn't just be a scar, it would be a prison. I started searching local codes, scouring city ordinances about property boundaries, construction permits, and easements. Hours of scrolling led me to one golden rule: any permanent structure near the property line without mutual consent was a violation. Gerald thought he was clever with his under 4 feet trick, but he hadn't counted on me knowing the law better than him. One evening, while walking the perimeter, I noticed fresh spray paint along the dirt-edged bright orange lines marking measurements. My pulse quickened. They weren't done. They were planning the next phase. I crouched down, tracing the markings with my finger, and realized they lined up too perfectly. Posts, likely fence posts. They weren't just boxing me in, they were going to make it official. Something they could point to and say, "See, it's regulation." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I set up extra cameras, hidden deeper in the shrubs, angled to catch every inch of movement along those orange lines. I even disguised one as a garden gnome, placing it right at the edge of the trench. If they so much as lifted a hammer, I'd see it. By the 4th night, the contractors returned. This time they carried equipment metal rods, bags of quick-set concrete, and wooden stakes. Gerald followed behind them like a general surveying his battlefield. I watched from the darkened window as they lowered rods into the trench and began mixing cement. The sound of shovels scraping against stone echoed in the night. My heart hammered in my chest, but my camera lenses blinked silently, capturing every detail. Then something unexpected happened. A neighbor, Mrs. Callahan from 2 houses down, shuffled into the street in her robe, her little dog tugging on the leash. She froze when she saw the work. "Gerald," she called, her voice uncertain. "What on earth are you doing?" Gerald straightened, clearly annoyed, but he put on that politician's smile he loved so much. "Good evening, Margaret." "Nothing to worry about. Just a minor modification for community safety." "Community safety?" she echoed, disbelief dripping from her voice. "It looks like you're digging a moat." There was laughter from one of the contractors, quickly stifled, but Gerald's smile didn't falter. "Boundaries, Margaret. Boundaries are important. Now, go back inside. It's late." Mrs. Callahan hesitated, frowning, but finally tugged her dog and retreated. I zoomed in on her face as she left. The look of suspicion was clear. And just like that, Gerald had made his first mistake in public. Someone else had seen the insanity firsthand. When they finished pouring cement into the first few rods, I felt both dread and exhilaration. Dread, because the trap was becoming real. Exhilaration, because I had caught it all. The footage showed the rods, the bags of cement, Gerald's dismissive words to Mrs. Callahan. It was more than evidence, now it was a story. A story I could tell in a way no one could deny. The next morning, I found flyers slipped into mailboxes up and down the street. Community Notice, the header read, with Gerald's signature at the bottom. It claimed the trench and upcoming boundary enhancements were safety measures to prevent soil erosion and protect neighborhood property values. The audacity nearly made me laugh. Soil erosion. The only thing eroding was sanity. But as I read, I realized how dangerous this was. Written words have power. People believe what they read, especially if it's dressed up as official. That was when I decided to push back in my own way. I drafted anonymous letters, simple and direct, with screenshots from my footage printed on them, Gerald laughing as the trench was dug, the contractors mixing cement, the conversation with Mrs. Callahan, transcribed word for word. I slipped those letters into mailboxes late at night, careful not to be seen. By morning, the whispers had grown louder. Neighbors gathered in small groups, passing the papers between them, their faces pale and confused. Gerald stormed around the street that day, his face red, demanding to know who was spreading lies. But I stayed silent, watching from my window, my cameras capturing his tantrum. The tension was building, a quiet war unfolding beneath the manicured lawns and polite facades. And I knew the climax was coming. Gerald wouldn't stop until he felt he had broken me completely. But what he didn't realize was that every move he made was tightening the noose around his own neck. That night, the contractors returned again, this time with wooden planks. They began building frameworks, hammering and sawing, the sound carrying through the still air. I sat in the dark, headphones on, listening to the audio recorder pick up every word. One contractor muttered, "This is insane, man. You sure this is legal?" Gerald snapped back, "Don't worry about legal. Just do the job. He'll be gone soon enough." My breath caught. There it was, the slip, the raw truth. Gerald wasn't protecting property values. He was trying to drive me out. That sentence alone was dynamite, the kind of thing no HOA could ever explain away. I clipped the audio immediately, saving it in 3 different places. But as the night wore on, a new fear crept in. Gerald wasn't just trying to intimidate me anymore. He was investing in something bigger, pouring money into contractors, materials, and lies. This wasn't the act of a man who wanted to scare meat. It was the obsession of someone who wanted to erase me. When the hammers finally fell silent and the trucks drove off, I stepped outside into the cool night air. I stood at the edge of the trench, staring at the half-built framework. The smell of fresh cement thick in the air. And in that moment, I made a silent vow. They could dig, they could build, they could smear my name across every street in this neighborhood, but I would not bend. I would not run. Because they didn't know what I had. They didn't know the eyes that watched them every second. Microphones that caught their lies, the files hidden where no one could reach. They thought I was alone, powerless. But I had patience, evidence, and a story that, when unleashed, would burn brighter than all their false notices combined. And if you've ever faced someone like Gerald, someone who thinks power makes them untouchable, then you know this truth. The higher they build their walls, the harder they fall when the ground crumbles beneath them. The second day after the trench appeared, the neighborhood buzzed with rumors. I could see them from my window, mothers pulling their children closer as they passed. Dog walkers pausing to stare, whispers exchanged over fences. No one dared to say anything to me directly, but the way their eyes darted between me and the trench said enough. I was already being painted as the villain, the stubborn recluse who brought this chaos upon himself. That's how the HOA worked. They never needed truth, just whispers and influence. Gerald was already spinning the story, no doubt, and soon the entire block would believe his version of events. But I had something he didn't proof. That morning I walked the perimeter carefully, camera in hand, documenting every detail of the destruction. The trench was uneven, some parts deep enough to twist an ankle, others shallow and ragged. My mailbox was hanging by a single screw, the roots of my oak trees exposed to the open air. The more I looked, the angrier I became. This wasn't just intimidation, it was sabotage. They wanted my home to rot, my yard to become unusable, my property value to drop until I had no choice but to sell and leave. It was a tactic as cruel as it was cowardly. Inside, I pulled up the footage again. Watching Gerald bark orders in the middle of the night gave me a bitter satisfaction. I paused, zoomed, clipped, and stitched the videos into a single reel that laid out the whole story. The equipment arriving, the trench being dug, the smirks and laughter. Gerald's voice clear above the noise. I made sure to highlight his little speech on my porch too, the moment he confessed their motives. When I played it back, I felt a cold rush of triumph. They thought they were untouchable, but I was holding the rope that could hang them. But still, I hesitated. Why? Because exposing them outright might not be enough. HOAs are slippery, built on bylaws and connections. Gerald would claim it was landscaping, or a boundary correction, or some nonsense dressed up in legal jargon. He'd muddy the waters until my evidence seemed like a misunderstanding. I knew their game too well. If I was going to strike, I had to wait for the moment when they were so deep in their own lies that the truth would crush them completely. The sun dipped low, and by evening, I noticed something strange. A sign had been hammered into the dirt mound near the trench. Bold letters reading, "Property modification under HOA authorization, do not interfere." My jaw clenched. They were doubling down, pretending this was official business. That sign wasn't just for MIT, was for the neighbors. A performance meant to solidify their narrative. If anyone asked, Gerald could point to it and say, "See, we're just doing our duty." I paced inside my living room, restless. That's when I remembered something the hidden mic. Weeks before, anticipating trouble, I had installed not just cameras, but a pair of disguised audio recorders in my front garden and porch lights. If Gerald or anyone else thought they could spin words, I wanted their voices unfiltered. I checked the files, scrolling through hours of static and wind until I found it, a recording from the night before. Gerald's voice, gruff and self-satisfied, saying, "We'll box him in. Make him regret ever thinking he could live here without us." Another board member chuckled, replying, "He won't last a month." I leaned back in my chair, listening again and again. That was it, the missing piece. Not just action, but intent. Evidence that they weren't performing maintenance, but carrying out a vendetta. And with that, my plan began to form. Still, I knew better than to underestimate them. Gerald didn't act alone. The board was full of people who fed off his power, and the neighbors were sheep too scared or too complicit to challenge him. If I moved too soon, they'd smear me, bury me in paperwork, or worse. So I waited, watching, recording, gathering more. Over the next week, the trench deepened. They came back at night, sometimes with lights, sometimes under cover of darkness. They widened parts of it, smoothed the edges, even sprayed herbicide near the roots of my garden. I filmed it all. I didn't interfere, didn't shout, didn't even step outside when they worked. Let them think I was broken. Let them think I was silent. Every day Gerald strutted past with that smug grin, convinced he had already won. But he didn't notice the neighbors' shifting eyes. He didn't notice how people started avoiding him when they walked their dogs, or how conversations hushed when he approached. They may not have said it aloud, but they were uneasy. A trench around a man's house wasn't normal, no matter how you justified it. And that unease was my ally. One evening while I reviewed footage, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A pair of men I didn't recognize, outsiders, not neighbors, were walking along the trench with Gerald, pointing at the layout, measuring with tape. One carried a clipboard. They looked like contractors. My stomach sank as I realized what this could mean. They weren't stopping with the trench. They were planning something bigger. A wall maybe, or a fence, or some structure that would trap me even more completely. That night, I barely slept. I kept the lights off, sat by the window, and watched the shadows move outside. Around 2 a.m, Gerald returned with the same 2 men. They spoke in low voices, but my recorder caught enough. "Foundation posts here," one said. "Won't need a permit if it's under 4 feet, Gerald replied. My fists clenched. They were going to build a barrier, something permanent. And that was when the decision crystallized. They were escalating, and if I didn't act soon, they'd bury me under concrete and lies. But I wouldn't just fight back. I'd let them dig their own graves first. The next morning I made coffee, sat at my desk, and opened a fresh folder on my computer labeled HOA Expos. I began compiling everything into one package: the footage, the audio, the photos, the timestamps. Every file was backed up. Twice. Once to a hard drive hidden under the floorboards, and once to a cloud account they'd never trace. And as I built the case, I realized something. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been bullied, cornered, or manipulated by people who thought they were above consequence. Gerald thought he was writing the story of my downfall. But in truth, I was writing his. And if you're reading this, if you've ever been outnumbered or silenced, remember, silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's the sharpest blade you can carry until it's time to strike. The night it started, I felt the air shift around my house, like the world itself was plotting against me. My home sat at the edge of the neighborhood, tucked between 2 large oak trees that had stood longer than the HOA itself, but I always knew they hated me. Not the trees, but the board. The smug little group of neighbors who thought their titles and rules gave them the right to strip me of my peace. I had defied them more times than I could count, refusing to paint my shutters beige, declining to remove my bird feeder, ignoring the letters about my driveway crack sand. Now they were striking back in a way that none of us could have predicted. I woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of machinery, muffled but heavy, the sort of sound that doesn't belong in the dark hours when the world should be still. I pulled the curtain back and froze as the floodlights from construction equipment cut across my lawn. They were digging, 3 of them with shovels and 2 with a small rented excavator. Their reflective vests glowing in the beams. And they weren't digging just anywhere, they were tracing the perimeter of my property, cutting into the earth as if they were preparing to wall me in. At first I thought I was hallucinating from lack of sleep, but the sight of dirt flying, the vibration in my floorboards, and the laughter of one of the men made it too real. The HOA had gone mad. They had dug up legal letters and sent threats before, but now they were using physical intimidation. My heart raced, anger and fear twisting together in my chest. Most people would have called the cops immediately, but I didn't, because unlike them, I was prepared. They didn't know that I had cameras hidden all around the property, tucked into birdhouses, disguised as decorative rocks, and fixed high on the gutters where nobody thought to look. Every move they made was already being recorded. Each smirk, each shove of soil into the growing trench. The board president, Gerald, stood near the excavator, his round frame casting a wide shadow. His arms were crossed, and I could see the satisfaction on his face. I hated that expression. He was the kind of man who lived for control, who thrived on forcing others to kneel to the rules, no matter how absurd. For months he had been trying to corner me into submission, but I refused. And this apparently was his last resort, make my home feel like a fortress under siege. I slipped away from the window and forced myself to breathe, gripping the edge of the counter until my knuckles whitened. Fear whispered that I was outnumbered, but another voice told me this was my chance. The footage would expose them all. No judge, no lawyer, no neighbor could ignore the insanity of the HOA tearing up my yard in the middle of the night. All I had to do was stay calm, gather the evidence, and wait for the right moment. The digging went on for hours. By sunrise, a rough trench carved its way around my property like a scar in the earth. My mailbox leaned dangerously where they had cut too close, and the edges of my flower bed were gone, churned into mud. They had circled me completely, leaving a 4-foot-wide ditch and piling the soil into crude mounds. It looked less like a neighborhood lawn and more like a battlefield. And when the morning walkers came, they saw. People slowed, phones came out, whispers carried through the air, but nobody dared to confront them. Not yet. I did not sleep. Instead, I brewed coffee, sat at the desk, and pulled up the camera feeds. I replayed the entire night's madness, watching Gerald point, instruct, and laugh as though this were all just a game. Each clip I saved, labeled, and backed up on a drive I kept hidden. My hands shook, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was focus. They thought I was cornered, but they had no idea what I held in my hands. Later that day, Gerald himself knocked on my door. When I opened it, he smiled like a man proud of his work. "Good morning," he said, his tone oily, false politeness dripping from every syllable. "We've decided that your property needed boundaries. You don't like following the rules, so we made some for you." I stared at him, keeping my expression neutral, though every nerve in me screamed to lash out. "You can't be serious," I said. "Oh, but we are," he replied, leaning slightly closer. "This is only the beginning. You'll find it very hard to live here without the HOA's support. Think about that before you push us again." And he walked away, leaving muddy boot prints on my porch. I closed the door, locked it, and laughed under my breath. Because every word, every smug grin had been caught on camera. They thought they'd broken me. But in truth, they had given me the kind of evidence that could burn their empire to the ground. This wasn't over. It was just starting. And if you're reading this, if you've ever dealt with people who think they can trap you, intimidate you, or bury you, then know this: there's always a way out. And sometimes the best weapon is simply watching when they think you're blind.